The woman standing at the edge of the raging Yellowstone River looked like she might throw herself into the churning waters, and Vernon Fletcher knew desperation when he saw it. He had been coming down from his trap lines in the mountains of Montana Territory when he spotted her standing there, a lone figure in a worn traveling dress that had once been fine, but now bore the stains and tears of hard travel. It was the spring of 1876, and the snowmelt had turned the usually manageable river into a roiling beast that crashed against its banks with the fury of 1,000 wild horses. The woman's shoulders shook, and even from 50 yards away, Vernon could see she was crying. He urged his pack mule forward, his own horse following behind with practiced ease. Vernon was not a man who sought out company. In fact, he had spent the better part of the last 8 years avoiding it, preferring the solitude of the high country where the only voices he heard belonged to the wind and the wolves. But something about the woman's posture, the way she stood so close to the water's edge, made his gut clench with concern. As he drew closer, he could make out more details. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and whipped around her face in the mountain breeze. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and she seemed to be arguing with someone. Vernon's eyes tracked to the crude ferry landing where a weathered man stood with his arms crossed, his face set in stubborn lines. "I told you, miss. No passengers today. River's too high. I ain't risking my ferry or my neck for nobody, especially not for no woman traveling alone without proper fare." The woman's voice carried on the wind, high and strained. "Please, I have money. I can pay you double once we reach the other side. My sister is in Williamsburg, just 20 miles north of here. She's expecting me. She's expecting her child any day now, and I promised I would be there. Please." The ferryman spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Double of nothing is still nothing. You already said you ain't got the fare now. And even if you did, I ain't taking this ferry across today. Water's too dangerous. Come back in a week, maybe 2. "I do not have a week. My sister needs me now." Vernon dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. He was a big man, standing well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and arms thick with muscle from years of hauling traps, chopping wood, and wrestling with the unforgiving wilderness. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his face bore the weathered tan of a man who lived under the open sky. His gray eyes, sharp as flint, took in the scene with the quiet assessment of someone who had learned to read danger in all its forms. "What is the problem here?" His voice was deep and rough from disuse, like gravel tumbling down a mountainside. The ferryman eyed him warily. "Ain't none of your concern, mister. This is between me and the lady." Vernon turned his attention to the woman. Up close, she was even younger than he had thought, perhaps 22 or 23, with eyes the color of rich coffee and a face that might have been pretty if it was not so drawn with worry and exhaustion. There was a small cut on her cheek, and her dress was torn at the hem. She had been through something difficult, that much was clear. "Miss," Vernon kept his voice gentle, the way he did when approaching a spooked animal, "are you all right?" She looked at him with those dark eyes, and he saw a flash of fear before it was replaced with determination. "I need to cross this river. My sister is on the other side in Williamsburg. She is about to have her first child, and I am the only family she has left. I promised her I would be there." "She ain't got the ferry fare," the ferryman interjected. "And even if she did, I already told her I ain't crossing today. River's too high, too fast. It would be suicide." Vernon walked to the river's edge and studied the water. The ferryman was right. The Yellowstone was running high and fast, swollen with snowmelt from the mountains. The ferry, a simple rope-guided platform, bobbed dangerously at its mooring. Even with the guide ropes, crossing would be treacherous. One wrong move and the whole thing could be swept downstream, passengers and all. But as Vernon looked at the water, his mind was already working. He had crossed worse in his years in the mountains. He had forded rivers, climbed cliffs, and survived blizzards that would have killed lesser men. More importantly, he had built things. Bridges, shelters, traps. He knew wood and rope and how to make them work together. He turned back to the woman. "What is your name, Miss Catherine Dalton?" Her voice trembled slightly, but she held his gaze. "Miss Dalton, I am Vernon Fletcher. I have been living in these mountains for 8 years, and I know this river. The ferryman is right. That ferry will not make it across today. But there is another way." Hope flickered in her eyes. "What way?" Vernon pointed downstream about a quarter mile. "There is a narrows down there. The river is faster, but it is also shallower, and there are rocks, big ones. They form a natural path across. It is not safe to wade, but with the right materials, a man could build a temporary bridge, something sturdy enough to walk across." The ferryman laughed. "You are crazy, mister. That would take days, maybe weeks, and even then it is still too dangerous." Vernon ignored him, his focus entirely on Catherine. "It would take me about 2 days to build something safe enough to cross. I have rope, I have tools, and I know how to work with what the land provides. If you can wait 2 days, Miss Dalton, I will build you a bridge and walk you across it myself." Catherine stared at him as if he had just offered to lasso the moon. "2 days? You would do that? But why? You do not even know me." Vernon was quiet for a moment. Why indeed? He had spent 8 years avoiding people, avoiding connections, avoiding anything that might tie him to the world below the high peaks. After his brother had died in a mining accident and his mother had followed from grief, 6 months later, Vernon had retreated to the mountains, seeking solace in solitude. He had told himself he was better off alone, that caring about people only led to pain. But looking at Catherine Dalton, with her desperate eyes and her torn dress and her fierce determination to reach her sister, Vernon felt something stir in his chest, something he had thought long dead. "Because you need help," he said simply, "and because it is the right thing to do." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I do not have money to pay you. Everything I had was stolen 3 days ago when my stage coach was robbed outside of Bozeman. They took my traveling money, my jewelry, everything except the clothes on my back. I barely escaped with my life." Vernon felt a surge of anger at whoever had done that to her. "I do not want your money, Miss Dalton. Just give me 2 days, and I will get you across that river." The ferryman shook his head and walked away, muttering about fools and their fool errands. But Vernon had already turned his attention to the task at hand. He led Catherine away from the ferry landing and downstream to the narrows he had mentioned. The river was indeed faster here, churning white around the large boulders that dotted its width, but it was also shallower, and the distance across was less than half what it was at the ferry landing. "Wait here," Vernon told Catherine. He unloaded his pack mule and his horse, removing bundles of furs he had trapped over the winter, his tools, his supplies. Then he began to walk the bank, studying the rocks, the water flow, the trees that grew close to the edge. His mind was already planning, calculating, measuring. Catherine watched him work, and slowly she began to understand that this strange mountain man was serious. He really was going to build a bridge. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Vernon set to work. He selected several long, straight pine trees that grew near the water's edge and began to cut them down with his axe. The sound of steel biting into wood echoed across the valley, a rhythmic thunder that spoke of purpose and determination. Catherine offered to help, but Vernon shook his head. "You are exhausted, Miss Dalton. Rest. Eat something if you have anything. You will need your strength for the crossing." "I do not have any food," she admitted quietly. Vernon paused in his work and walked back to his supplies. He pulled out a bundle of dried venison, some hardtack, and a small sack of coffee. "Here. It is not much, but it will keep you going." Catherine took the food with trembling hands. "Thank you. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "No need," Vernon said gruffly, already turning back to his work. As Catherine ate, she studied the mountain man who had appeared like something out of a dream. He moved with the confident ease of someone completely at home in the wilderness. His muscles bunched and flexed as he swung the axe, and she found herself mesmerized by the sheer physical power he displayed. She had met plenty of men in her life, especially during her time working as a schoolteacher in St. Louis, but none of them had been like Vernon Fletcher. He was raw and untamed, like the land itself, and yet there was a gentleness in his eyes when he looked at her that made her heart do strange things. By the time evening fell, Vernon had felled 6 large trees and had begun stripping them of their branches. Catherine had made herself useful by gathering the smaller branches into piles, which Vernon said he would use to create cross supports. As darkness crept across the land, Vernon built a fire and showed Catherine how to set up his simple camp. "You can sleep in my tent," he said, nodding toward the small canvas structure he had erected. "I will sleep by the fire." "I cannot take your tent," Catherine protested. "You can and you will," Vernon said firmly. "You have been through enough, Miss Dalton. Take what comfort is available." That night, as Catherine lay in Vernon's tent wrapped in his extra blankets, she found herself thinking about the mountain man who slept outside by the fire. She had been so frightened when the stagecoach was robbed, so terrified as she stumbled through the wilderness trying to find her way to Williamsburg. She had thought she would die out here, alone and forgotten. But Vernon had appeared, solid and strong and utterly reliable, and for the first time in days, Catherine felt safe. The next morning, Vernon was up before dawn, already back at work. Catherine emerged from the tent to find him waist-deep in the river, examining the rocks and testing the current. The water was clearly freezing, fresh from the mountain snowpack, but Vernon seemed unbothered. He climbed out, his clothes dripping, and went right back to work on the trees. "How can I help?" Catherine asked, determined to be useful. Vernon considered her for a moment. "Can you tie knots?" "I can learn." Vernon showed her how to tie several different knots using his rope, patiently repeating the instructions until she got them right. Then he set her to work preparing sections of rope while he continued to work on the logs. As the day wore on, Catherine began to see the bridge take shape in her mind, even though it did not yet exist in reality. Vernon was building it piece by piece, first securing anchor points on both sides of the river using the largest trees as supports, then slowly extending the main walkway using the other logs. It was back-breaking work. Vernon waded into the icy water again and again, positioning logs, securing them with rope and wooden pegs he carved himself. Catherine did what she could, holding ropes, passing him tools, preparing the materials he needed. They worked in a comfortable silence, broken only by Vernon's occasional instructions. By mid-afternoon, Catherine could no longer contain her curiosity. "How did you learn to do this? To build things like this?" Vernon was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My father was a builder. Bridges, mostly, for the railroad companies pushing west. He taught me and my brother everything he knew. We were supposed to work with him, building the future, he called it. But then he died when a bridge collapsed during construction. My brother and we went our separate ways after that. He went into mining, I went into the mountains." "I am sorry," Catherine said softly, "about your father. And you said Your brother too, Vernon nodded, his face shadowing. Mining accident, 8 years ago. After that, I decided I was done with people and their dangerous endeavors. I went into the mountains and stayed there. But you came down, you found me. I come down twice a year to trade my furs. This was supposed to be a quick trip. Get my supplies, head back up. He glanced at her. I am glad I came down when I did. Catherine felt warmth spread through her chest. So am I. As the sun began to set on the second day, the bridge was nearly complete. It was a rough thing, not pretty, but it was solid. Vernon had built a walkway about 3 feet wide using the largest logs, supported by cross beams and anchored at multiple points to the large rocks in the river. Rope railings ran along both sides, giving something to hold on to. The whole structure was low to the water, and in places, the spray from the rushing river splashed across the logs, but it was sound. Vernon tested it himself first, walking slowly across while Catherine held her breath on the shore. The bridge held. He walked back, adjusted a few ropes, then crossed again. Satisfied, he nodded. It will hold. We will cross in the morning when the light is better. That night they sat by the fire together, and for the first time they really talked. Catherine told him about her life in St. Louis, about teaching school and loving the children but always feeling like something was missing. She told him about her sister Clara, who had married a rancher and moved to Montana Territory 2 years ago, full of hope and dreams. Clara's letters always sounded so happy, Catherine said, staring into the flames. She wrote about the wide open spaces, the sky that went on forever, the feeling of freedom. When she wrote to say she was expecting a baby and asked if I could come help her, I did not hesitate. I quit my teaching position, sold everything I had, and bought a ticket west. I thought it would be an adventure. And then you were robbed. Yes, there were 3 men. They stopped the stagecoach on a lonely stretch of road. The driver tried to fight, but they shot him. Not fatally, thank God, but enough that he could not drive. They took everything from all the passengers. One of the men, he looked at me in a way that made my blood run cold. He said they should take me with them. But another man said I was not worth the trouble. They argued, and while they were distracted, I ran. I ran into the forest and just kept running. By the time I stopped, I was lost. Vernon's jaw clenched. If I ever meet those men, they will regret their choices. The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Catherine's heart skip. You saved my life, Vernon. If you had not found me, if you had not built this bridge, I do not know what I would have done. Vernon looked at her across the fire, and something passed between them, something electric and undeniable. I am glad I found you, Catherine. The way he said her name, slow and careful like he was tasting it, made her shiver despite the warmth of the fire. That night, Catherine lay in the tent thinking about Vernon's hands, rough and strong and capable. She thought about the way he looked at her, like she was something precious that needed protecting. She had never felt this way about a man before, this strange combination of safety and excitement, comfort and attraction. It both thrilled and terrified her. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Vernon checked the bridge one final time, tugging on ropes, testing the stability of each log. Catherine packed up the camp, rolling blankets and bundling supplies with the efficiency Vernon had taught her over the past 2 days. When everything was ready, Vernon loaded his mule and horse, then turned to Catherine. I will go first. I will be carrying most of the supplies. You will follow behind me and you will hold onto the rope railings at all times. Do not look down at the water. Keep your eyes on me. If you feel unsteady, stop and breathe. I will not let anything happen to you. Do you understand? Catherine nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. Now that the moment was here, she felt fear clench her stomach. The river was so loud, so fast. The bridge looked so small against its fury. Vernon must have seen her fear because he stepped closer and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against hers. "Catherine, look at me." She raised her eyes to his and found herself drowning in that gray gaze. "I built this bridge with my own hands. I tested every log, every rope, every joint. It is solid, it will hold, and I will be right there with you every step of the way. Do you trust me?" Did she trust him? This man she had known for only 2 days. This stranger from the mountains who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. "Yes," Catherine whispered. "I trust you." Vernon squeezed her hand once, then released it. "Then let us get you to your sister." They started across the bridge. Vernon went first, leading his horse and mule with practiced ease. The animals were nervous about the water but trusted Vernon enough to follow. Catherine came behind, her hands gripping the rope railings so tightly her knuckles turned white. The bridge swayed slightly under their weight, and the river roared just feet below, sending up spray that dampened her skirts. She kept her eyes on Vernon's broad back, on the way his muscles moved under his shirt, on the confident set of his shoulders. He was steady as a mountain, and she drew strength from that steadiness. One step, then another, then another. The river seemed to grab at her skirts, hungry and angry that they were defying it, but the bridge held firm. Halfway across, Catherine's foot slipped on a wet log. She gasped, her heart leaping into her throat, but Vernon was there instantly. He had tied the animal's leads to a rope loop on his belt, leaving his hands free, and now those hands caught her, steadied her, held her safe. "I've got you," he said, his voice calm and sure. "You are all right. Just breathe." Catherine breathed, focusing on the feel of his hands on her arms, strong and secure. After a moment, her racing heart slowed. "I am all right now. Good, we are almost there, just a little farther." They continued across, and then suddenly they were on the other side, on solid ground, safe. Catherine wanted to collapse in relief, but Vernon was already there, catching her as her knees buckled, holding her up. "You did it," he said, and there was unmistakable pride in his voice. "You were very brave." Catherine looked up at him, and without thinking, she threw her arms around his neck and hugged him. Vernon stiffened in surprise, then slowly, carefully, his arms came around her, holding her close. Catherine pressed her face against his chest and breathed in the scent of him, pine and smoke and something essentially masculine that made her head spin. "Thank you," she whispered against his shirt. "Thank you for everything." Vernon held her for a long moment, and Catherine could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her cheek. Then, reluctantly, he released her and stepped back. "We should get moving. Williamsburg is still about 20 miles north. We can make it by nightfall if we keep a good pace." Catherine blinked in surprise. You are coming with me." Vernon was already untying his animals. "You think I am going to get you across the river and then let you walk 20 miles alone through wilderness country? No, Miss Dalton. I will see you safely to your sister's door. But your furs, your trading, your supplies, can wait. You cannot." As they walked north along the rough trail that led to Williamsburg, Catherine found herself studying Vernon when she thought he was not looking. She had never met anyone like him. He moved through the wilderness with the ease of someone who belonged there, reading signs in the forest that Catherine could not even see. He pointed out animal tracks, told her which plants were edible, showed her how to find water by watching where the birds flew. "You love it here," Catherine observed as they stopped to rest and water the animals at a small creek. "The mountains, the wilderness, you really do prefer it to civilization." Vernon considered the question as he filled his canteen. "I suppose I do. Up in the mountains, things are simple, clear. You know what you are dealing with. A storm is just a storm. A bear is just a bear. There is no pretense, no lies, no betrayal, just survival and beauty and peace. But is it not lonely, Vernon was quiet for a long time. "It was," he finally said. "Until 2 days ago, I would have said I preferred the loneliness to the alternative, but now I am not so sure." He looked at Catherine as he said this, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. She knew what he meant because she felt it too. In just 2 days, something had formed between them. A connection, a bond forged in shared effort and mutual trust. She had never believed in love at first sight, had always thought it was the stuff of silly novels. But what she felt for Vernon Fletcher was undeniable and powerful and utterly terrifying in its intensity. They reached Williamsburg just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. It was a small settlement, barely a town, consisting of a general store, a church, a small schoolhouse, and about 20 scattered ranches and homesteads. Vernon asked at the general store for directions to the Donovan Ranch, Clara Dalton's married name, and the shopkeeper pointed them north about 2 miles. When they reached the ranch house, a small but well-built structure surrounded by corrals and outbuildings, Catherine nearly wept with relief. She could see lamplight in the windows, smoke rising from the chimney. Her sister was there, so close now after everything. Before she could knock, the door flew open and a woman stood there, very pregnant and very surprised. "Catherine, Catherine, oh my God, you are here. I thought something terrible had happened. Your telegram said you would arrive 5 days ago, and when you did not come, I thought." The woman, Clara, began to cry, and then Catherine was crying, and the two sisters were hugging each other, laughing and weeping at the same time. Vernon stood back, holding the reins of his animals, feeling suddenly awkward and out of place. A man appeared behind Clara, tall and weathered with kind eyes. "Clara, honey, you should not be standing in the doorway. Come inside. Who is this?" Clara pulled back from Catherine and seemed to notice Vernon for the first time. "Oh, I am sorry. Catherine, who is this?" Catherine turned to Vernon, and her eyes were shining with tears and gratitude and something deeper. "This is Vernon Fletcher. He saved my life. He built a bridge across the Yellowstone River so I could reach you. He is the reason I am here." Clara and her husband, whose name was James Donovan, insisted that Vernon come inside, that he stay for dinner, that he accept their hospitality. Vernon tried to refuse, uncomfortable with the attention, but Catherine caught his hand and squeezed it. "Please," she said softly, "stay, at least for tonight." Vernon could not refuse her. Over dinner, the whole story came out. The robbery, Catherine's desperate flight, her arrival at the river, Vernon's bridge. Clara kept stopping the narrative to hug her sister or to thank Vernon profusely. James shook Vernon's hand so many times it became almost comical. "You are a godsend," Clara said, wiping her eyes. "I have been beside myself with worry. James wanted to go looking for her, but I am so close to my time he could not leave me. If you had not found her, if you had not helped her." "But I did," Vernon said simply. "And she is here now, safe and sound." After dinner, James showed Vernon to the barn where he could bed down for the night with his animals. "It is not much, but the hay is clean and there are extra blankets in the tack room," James said. "You are welcome to stay as long as you like, Mr. Fletcher. Anyone who helps my family is a friend of this house." Vernon thanked him and settled his animals, giving them grain and fresh water. As he was spreading his bedroll in the hay, he heard the barn door open. Catherine stood there, silhouetted by the lamplight from the house. "May I come in?" she asked. "Of course." Catherine walked into the barn, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "I wanted to thank you again, properly, without my sister crying and hugging everyone." Vernon felt a small smile tug at his lips. "She seems very glad you are here." "She is, and so am I." Catherine moved closer, and in the dim light of the single lantern, she looked almost ethereal. "Vernon, I know we have only known each other for 2 days, but I feel like I have known you much longer. Does that sound foolish?" "No," Vernon said, his voice rough. "It does not sound foolish at all. I do not want to say goodbye to you. I know you have your life in the mountains, your solitude, and I am just a woman you happen to help. But I want you to know that these 2 days with you have meant more to me than months with anyone else. You are an extraordinary man, Vernon Fletcher." Vernon stood there, looking at this woman who had somehow, in just 2 days, turned his entire world upside down. He had spent 8 years building walls around his heart, convincing himself he was better off alone. But Catherine had walked right through those walls without even trying. "Catherine," he said, and his voice was barely more than a whisper. "You are not just a woman I happen to help. You are the first person in 8 years who has made me want to come down from the mountains." Catherine's breath caught. "What are you saying?" Vernon stepped closer to her, close enough that he could see the way her pulse fluttered in her throat, close enough to smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her despite days of hard travel. "I am saying that I do not want to say goodbye either. I am saying that maybe I have been alone long enough. I am saying that if you would allow it, I would like to stay near, to see where this might lead. You would do that. You would leave your mountains. I would come down from them more often. I would find a balance. Because, Catherine, in 2 days you have become more important to me than 8 years of solitude. And that terrifies me, but it also feels right in a way nothing has felt right since I lost my family." Catherine reached up and cupped his face in her small hands. "Vernon Fletcher, I think I am falling in love with you." Vernon's heart, that organ he had thought frozen solid, cracked open. "I know I am falling in love with you." When they kissed, it was soft and sweet and tasted of new beginnings. Vernon wrapped his arms around Catherine, holding her close, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. Catherine's fingers tangled in his long hair, pulling him closer, and for a long moment the rest of the world fell away. There was only the two of them, the mountain man and the woman he had built a bridge for, finding something neither had expected. They pulled apart reluctantly, both breathing hard. Catherine smiled up at him, her eyes bright with happiness. "What do we do now?" "Now," Vernon said, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "I help you get settled with your sister. I stay nearby, maybe find some work on one of the ranches around here. I court you properly the way you deserve, and we see where this leads. Does that sound acceptable?" "It sounds perfect." Over the following weeks, Vernon did exactly as he had promised. He stayed in Williamsburg, taking a job as a general handyman and builder for several of the local ranchers. His skills were in high demand, and soon he had more work than he could handle. He built fences, repaired barns, and even helped James Donovan expand his ranch house in preparation for the baby. Catherine stayed with her sister, helping Clara through the final weeks of her pregnancy. During the day, Catherine assisted with household chores, prepared meals, and made the house ready for a newborn. In the evenings, Vernon would come by, and he and Catherine would take long walks around the property, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Vernon told her about his childhood, about his father's passion for building and his mother's gentle strength. He told her about his brother Marcus, who had been reckless and adventurous and full of life right up until the moment the mine collapsed. He told her about the guilt he had carried for years, the feeling that he should have died instead of his brother, the way grief had driven him into the mountains. Catherine listened without judgment, holding his hand, offering quiet comfort. In return, she told him about her own childhood, about growing up in St. Louis with Clara, about their parents who had died of influenza when Catherine was 18. She told him about her love of teaching, about the children she had adored, but also about the loneliness of being a single woman in a city where everyone seemed to have someone. "I always thought I would get married," Catherine confessed one evening as they sat on the porch of the Donovan house, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant colors. "But none of the men who courted me ever felt right. They were nice enough, but there was no spark, no connection. I began to think maybe I was too particular, or maybe there was something wrong with me." Vernon took her hand and laced his fingers through hers. "There is nothing wrong with you. You were just waiting for the right person. And you think you are the right person?" Catherine asked, but she was smiling. "I think I would very much like to be." 3 weeks after Catherine arrived in Williamsburg, Clara gave birth to a healthy baby boy. James was overjoyed, and Clara glowed with happiness despite her exhaustion. Catherine helped with the delivery, staying by her sister's side through the long hours of labor. And when the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Catherine wept with joy. Vernon arrived at the house the next morning with a cradle he had built in his spare time, a beautiful piece of workmanship made from pine and sanded smooth as silk. Clara cried when she saw it, and James pumped Vernon's hand in gratitude. "You are too good to us," Clara said, holding her son close. "First you save my sister's life, then you stay and help us. How can we ever thank you?" "You already have," Vernon said, glancing at Catherine. "More than you know." As spring turned to summer, Vernon and Catherine's courtship deepened. Vernon was unlike any man Catherine had ever known. He was quiet and thoughtful, but when he spoke, his words carried weight. He was strong and capable, but also gentle, especially with her. He brought her wildflowers from the meadows, taught her how to fish in the nearby creek, and showed her the hidden beauty of the Montana wilderness. Catherine, in turn, brought softness into Vernon's life. She mended his clothes, cooked him meals that were far better than the simple fare he was used to, and most importantly, she made him laugh. Vernon had not realized how much he had missed laughter until Catherine teased him about his overgrown hair one day, and he found himself chuckling despite himself. "If it bothers you so much, you are welcome to cut it," Vernon said, amused by the way Catherine kept eyeing his hair with a critical expression. "Would you let me?" Catherine asked, surprised. "I would let you do just about anything," Vernon admitted, and the honesty in his voice made Catherine's heart skip. So one sunny afternoon, Catherine sat Vernon down outside the barn and carefully trimmed his hair. She did not cut it short, knowing he liked it long, but she shaped it, removing the split ends and the uneven lengths until it fell in thick, dark waves to his shoulders. As she worked, her fingers running through his hair, Vernon closed his eyes and allowed himself to simply feel. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with such care, such tenderness. When Catherine finished, she walked around to face him and smiled. "Much better. You are quite handsome when you are not hiding behind all that hair." Vernon caught her hand and pulled her closer until she stood between his knees. "You think I am handsome?" Catherine blushed prettily. "I think you are the most handsome man I have ever seen." Vernon stood, his hands settling on her waist. "Catherine Dalton, I love you. I have loved you since the moment you trusted me enough to walk across that bridge, maybe even before that. And I know we have not been courting very long, but I am not a young man anymore, and I do not see the point in wasting time. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to build you a house, fill it with children, and grow old watching sunsets with you. Will you marry me?" Catherine stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "You want to marry me, truly, more than I have ever wanted anything?" "Yes," Catherine breathed. "Yes, yes, yes. Of course I will marry you." Vernon let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and pulled Catherine into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. Catherine laughed, the sound bright and joyous, and when Vernon set her down, they kissed with all the passion and promise of a future together. They were married a month later in the small church in Williamsburg. Clara and James stood up with them, and most of the town attended, curious about the mountain man who had built a bridge for love and the schoolteacher from St. Louis who had stolen his heart. Catherine wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, and Vernon wore new clothes purchased specially for the occasion, though he drew the line at cutting his hair shorter than Catherine already had. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the marriage, the congregation was silent except for Clara's baby, who chose that moment to let out a loud gurgle that sounded almost like approval. Everyone laughed, and Vernon and Catherine exchanged vows with tears in their eyes and joy in their hearts. After the wedding, Vernon took Catherine to a piece of land he had purchased just outside of town. It was beautiful property, nestled against the foothills with a view of the mountains to the west and rolling meadows to the east. A creek ran through one corner, and there were stands of pine and aspen scattered across the acreage. "This is ours," Vernon told Catherine as they stood together looking out over the land. "I bought it with the money I saved from my furs and from the work I have been doing. I want to build us a home here, Catherine. A real home. Not just a house, but a place where we can build a life together." Catherine looked at the land, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the endless Montana sky, and felt a sense of rightness settle over her. "It is perfect. We are going to be so happy here," and they were. Vernon built them a house with his own hands, a solid structure of logs and stone that could withstand the harsh Montana winters. It was not fancy, but it was well made and warm and filled with light. Catherine helped where she could, and together they created a home that reflected both of them, practical and strong but also comfortable and welcoming. As the house took shape, so did their marriage. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's quirks and preferences. Vernon learned that Catherine liked to sing while she worked, that she had a fierce temper when roused but forgave quickly, and that she had a way of making even the simplest meal feel special. Catherine learned that Vernon was a man of few words but deep feelings, that he showed his love through actions rather than speeches, and that, beneath his stoic exterior, beat the heart of a true romantic. Their first winter together was hard. The Montana cold was brutal, and there were days when the snow was so deep they could not leave the house. But trapped inside with Vernon, Catherine found she did not mind. They spent long evenings by the fire, Vernon carving or mending tools while Catherine sewed or read aloud from the few books they owned. They talked about their dreams for the future, about the children they hoped to have, about growing old together in this wild, beautiful place. In the spring, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. Vernon's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her into his arms with a whoop of joy, then immediately set her down gently as if she were made of glass. "Careful," he said, his hands hovering over her as if he were afraid she might break. "You need to be careful now." Catherine laughed, delighted by his protectiveness. "Vernon, I am pregnant, not made of spun sugar. I am not going to break." But Vernon was not to be dissuaded. For the next several months, he treated Catherine like precious cargo, helping her with every task, refusing to let her lift anything heavy, and building her a rocking chair with the smoothest motion imaginable so she could sit comfortably as her belly grew. Their son was born on a crisp autumn morning, delivered with the help of Clara and the local midwife. Vernon paced outside the bedroom, nearly wearing a hole in the floor with his worry, until finally the midwife opened the door with a smile. "You have a son, Mr. Fletcher. A big, healthy boy. And your wife is doing just fine." Vernon burst into the room and found Catherine propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face and smiled. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Vernon approached the bed as if in a dream. He looked down at the baby, at the tiny face and the impossibly small fingers, and felt his heart expand in a way he had not thought possible. This was his son, his and Catherine's. A new life, a new beginning. "He is perfect," Vernon whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like his mother." They named the baby Marcus, after Vernon's brother, and from the moment Vernon held his son for the first time, he was utterly besotted. The big, strong mountain man who had survived alone in the wilderness for 8 years turned to complete mush in the presence of his infant son. He sang to Marcus in a deep, rumbling voice, carved him toys, and spent hours just watching him sleep, marveling at the miracle of his existence. Catherine watched her husband with their son and fell even more deeply in love with him. She had known Vernon was a good man, but seeing him as a father revealed depths of tenderness and devotion she had only glimpsed before. As Marcus grew from an infant to a toddler, Vernon and Catherine's life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Vernon continued to work as a builder and handyman, his reputation for quality work spreading throughout the region. Catherine, when Marcus was old enough, began teaching again, starting a small school in their home for the children of nearby ranches who had no other access to education. They had 2 more children over the years, a daughter they named Violet and another son they called Thomas. Each time, Vernon was just as protective, just as awestruck, just as devoted. The house he had built expanded to accommodate their growing family, and the land they had claimed together became a true homestead, productive and prosperous. But through all the changes, through all the busy years of raising children and building a life, Vernon and Catherine never forgot the bridge. Every year on the anniversary of the day they met, they would leave the children with Clara and James and ride south to the Yellowstone River. The temporary bridge Vernon had built was long gone, of course, washed away by the river's relentless flow, but the memory remained. They would stand on the bank where Catherine had once stood desperate and alone, and Vernon would take her hand. "I would build you 1,000 bridges," he would say. "I would build you one every day for the rest of my life if that was what it took to keep you safe." And Catherine would squeeze his hand and smile. "You only needed to build me one bridge that led me to you. That was enough to change everything." On their 10th anniversary, when Marcus was 9, Violet was 6, and Thomas was 3, Vernon surprised Catherine with a gift. He led her blindfolded to the creek that ran through their property, and when he removed the blindfold, Catherine gasped. Vernon had built a bridge. Not a temporary, rough thing like the one he had constructed over the Yellowstone, but a beautiful, solid structure of wood and stone that arced gracefully over the water. It was wide enough for a wagon to cross, with sturdy railings carved with intricate designs of mountains and rivers and trees. At one end, Vernon had placed a small plaque with words carved deep into the wood, "For Catherine, who trusted me enough to cross. All my love always, Vernon." Catherine read the words and began to cry. Vernon pulled her into his arms, and she pressed her face against his chest just as she had done that first day on the other side of the river, when he had carried her across the bridge he built. "Why did you build this?" Catherine asked through her tears. "The creek is small. We can wade across it easily." "Because I wanted you to have a bridge that would last," Vernon said simply. "One that our children can cross, and their children, and their children after that. I wanted to build something that would stand as long as our love stands, which is to say forever." Catherine pulled back and looked up at her husband, this man who had appeared in her life when she needed him most, who had literally built a bridge to help her across an impossible river, who had given her a home and a family and a love deeper than any river and stronger than any mountain. "I love you, Vernon Fletcher," she said. "I loved you when you were a lonely mountain man. I loved you when you built me the first bridge. And I love you now, standing here with you after 10 years of marriage. I will love you for the rest of my life and beyond." Vernon cupped her face in his large, work-roughened hands. "And I love you, Catherine Fletcher. You saved me just as surely as I saved you. You brought me down from the mountain and gave me a reason to live in the world again. You are my heart, my home, my everything." They kissed there on their bridge, with the Montana sun warming their faces and the sound of their children's laughter drifting from the house. It was a perfect moment, one of many they would share over the course of their long life together. Years passed, as years do. Marcus grew into a fine young man who inherited his father's skill with building and his mother's way with words. He became an engineer, designing bridges and roads throughout Montana Territory and beyond. Violet became a teacher like her mother, opening a school in Williamsburg that served children from all over the region. Thomas, the youngest, inherited his father's love of the wilderness and became a guide, leading hunting and fishing expeditions into the mountains Vernon had once called home. Vernon and Catherine grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces bearing the lines of a life well lived. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, deepened by shared experiences and mutual respect, and the simple joy of waking up next to each other every morning. Clara and James remained close friends, their families intertwining as their children grew up together and eventually had children of their own. The story of how Vernon built a bridge across the Yellowstone River to help a desperate woman reach her sister became something of a local legend, told and retold in the town of Williamsburg until it took on an almost mythical quality. But for Vernon and Catherine, it was never a myth. It was simply the truth of how they had met, how they had fallen in love, how they had built a life together against all odds. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the whole town of Williamsburg turned out to celebrate. There was a dance at the church, a feast prepared by dozens of willing hands, and speeches that went on so long Vernon threatened to build a bridge just to escape them all. Everyone laughed because by then, Vernon was known not just for his building skills, but also for his dry sense of humor that had emerged over decades of happy marriage. Marcus stood up to give a speech about his parents, and his voice was thick with emotion. "My father once told me that he spent 8 years in the mountains trying to outrun his pain. He said he thought he was done with the world, done with people, done with caring. But then he met my mother, and she changed everything. She gave him a reason to come down from the mountain. And in return, he built her a bridge, not just over a river, but into a new life. That is what love does. It builds bridges where there were none before. It creates paths where there was only wilderness. And it endures, even when the waters rise and the storms come, because it is built on a foundation of trust and sacrifice and devotion." Catherine, sitting beside Vernon with her hand clasped in his, looked at her son with shining eyes. Vernon squeezed her hand and leaned over to whisper in her ear. "He has your way with words." "And your heart," Catherine whispered back. That night, after the celebration had ended and their children and grandchildren had returned to their own homes, Vernon and Catherine sat together on the porch of the house he had built for her 50 years ago. The moon was full, casting silver light across the land they had claimed together, and in the distance, they could hear the creek flowing under the bridge Vernon had built for their 10th anniversary. "You ever regret it?" Vernon asked quietly. "Coming west, I mean. Your life was in St. Louis. You had a career, a future planned out. And then everything went wrong, and you ended up here in the middle of nowhere with a mountain man." Catherine turned to look at her husband, this man she had loved for 50 years, and smiled. "Vernon Fletcher, meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Yes, my stagecoach was robbed. Yes, I lost everything I owned. Yes, I was terrified and alone and desperate. But all of that led me to you. It led me to this life, these children, this home. How could I possibly regret any of it, even the scary parts? The river crossing, especially the river crossing," Catherine said firmly. "Because that was when I learned that I could trust you completely. That was when I saw the kind of man you were, someone who would literally build a bridge to help a stranger. That was when I started to fall in love with you." Vernon was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. "I was so scared that day. When you were walking across that bridge, when your foot slipped, I thought my heart would stop. I realized in that moment that I could not bear it if anything happened to you. I had just met you. I barely knew you, but already you had become essential to me. I knew then that I was in trouble, that I was falling for you whether I wanted to or not. And did you want to? Fall for me, I mean." "I fought it at first," Vernon admitted. "I was convinced I was better off alone, but you were so brave, Catherine. So determined to reach your sister, so fierce despite your fear. And you looked at me like I was a hero, when really I was just a lonely man who had been running from life for too long. You made me want to be the man you saw when you looked at me." Catherine reached up and touched Vernon's face, her fingers tracing the familiar lines and angles she knew as well as her own. "You were already that man. You just needed someone to remind you." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the sounds of the Montana night. After a while, Catherine spoke again. "Vernon, do you remember what you said to me that first day, when you told me you would build the bridge? I said I would build you a bridge and walk you over it safely." "You did more than that," Catherine said softly. "You have been walking beside me safely for 50 years. Every bridge we have had to cross, every challenge we have faced, you have been right there with me. And I have tried to be there for you too." "You have," Vernon said, his voice thick with emotion. "Catherine, you saved my life just as much as I saved yours, maybe more. I was alive in those mountains, but I was not really living. You taught me how to live again. You taught me how to love again. You gave me back everything I thought I had lost." They held each other there on the porch, two people who had found each other against all odds and had built a life together that was richer and fuller than either could have imagined. The moon cast their shadows long across the porch, two figures blending into one. Vernon and Catherine lived another 10 years after that anniversary. Years filled with more grandchildren, more sunsets, more quiet moments of contentment. When Vernon died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 85, Catherine was holding his hand, and his last words were her name. She followed him 6 months later, dying as quietly as he had, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their homestead, with a view of the mountains to the west and the bridge Vernon had built to the east. Their shared headstone bore simple words that their children had chosen carefully. Vernon and Catherine Fletcher. He built her a bridge. She gave him a home. Together they built a life. Beloved parents, grandparents, and friends. The bridge Vernon built over the creek remained long after they were gone. Their children maintained it, then their grandchildren, then their great-grandchildren. It became a tradition in the Fletcher family to gather at the bridge every year on the anniversary of Vernon and Catherine's meeting, to remember the story of the desperate woman and the mountain man who built her a bridge, and to celebrate the enduring power of love. Marcus, in his later years, wrote down the full story of his parents' meeting and courtship, wanting to preserve it for future generations. The manuscript was passed down through the family and eventually published as a small volume that became treasured in the Williamsburg area. People came from miles around to see the bridge, to hear the story, to stand where Vernon and Catherine had once stood and feel the power of their legacy. But the real legacy was not in the bridge itself, sturdy and beautiful though it was. The real legacy was in the family Vernon and Catherine had created, in the love they had shared, in the example they had set of devotion and sacrifice and enduring commitment. Their children learned from them how to love deeply and truly. Their grandchildren learned from them that sometimes the greatest adventures come from taking chances on people, from reaching out to help someone in need, from building bridges instead of walls. The story of Vernon and Catherine Fletcher became more than just a local legend. It became a symbol of what was possible when two people found each other at exactly the right moment, when need met capability, when loneliness met understanding, when two hearts recognized in each other the perfect complement. Decades after their deaths, when Williamsburg had grown from a small settlement into a proper town, the community decided to honor Vernon and Catherine's memory in a special way. They commissioned a statue to be placed in the town square, depicting a man and a woman crossing a bridge together. The man's hand extended to steady the woman's face turned toward him with trust and love. The sculptor captured something essential about Vernon and Catherine, a sense of strength and tenderness, protection and partnership. At the base of the statue, a plaque was placed with the story of how they met, and it concluded with words that Catherine herself had written in a letter to her sister shortly after her marriage. Love, when it is true, builds bridges. It connects us across the impossible distances between hearts. It carries us safely over troubled waters, and it endures strong and sturdy long after the initial crossing is done. I was lost when I met Vernon, stranded on the wrong side of a raging river with no way across. He could have left me there. He could have saved himself the trouble. But he chose to help me instead, and in doing so he gave me everything. A way across the river, a home, a family, a love that has become the foundation of everything I am. If you ever doubt the power of kindness, of sacrifice, of reaching out to help someone in need, remember this. One man built one bridge and it changed two lives forever. Those words, carved in bronze, greeted visitors to Williamsburg for generations. And somewhere up in the mountains that ringed the valley, where the pine trees grew tall and the creeks ran clear and cold, where a lonely man once lived in self-imposed isolation, the wind whispered through the trees like a song of gratitude. Because those mountains had given Vernon Fletcher peace when he needed it, but they had also known when it was time to send him back down to the valley, back down to the river where a woman waited desperately for help, back down to the moment that would define the rest of his life. The ferryman who had refused to take Catherine across the river that day also became part of the story, though not in a way he would have wanted. He became the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when we let fear and selfishness guide our choices. He had looked at Catherine and seen only risk and inconvenience. Vernon had looked at her and seen someone who needed help, and more than that, he had seen possibility. The ferryman stayed safe and alone. Vernon took a chance and found everything. In the end, that was what the story of Vernon and Catherine Fletcher taught the people of Williamsburg and everyone who heard it. That the greatest rewards in life come not from playing it safe, but from reaching out, from taking chances, from building bridges toward each other instead of walls between us. That love is not something that happens to us, but something we build, piece by piece, decision by decision, day by day. And that sometimes the bridges we build to help others across their troubled waters become the very paths that lead us home to where we always belonged. The creek still flows through the Fletcher homestead, and the bridge still stands, weathered by time but solid as ever. On quiet evenings when the light is just right, some people swear they can see two figures walking across it together. A tall man with broad shoulders and long hair, and a woman in a simple dress, her hand tucked securely in his. They are only shadows, tricks of the light and the imagination, but somehow they feel real enough to remind everyone who sees them that love, true love, endures. It outlasts the flesh, outlives the moment, and remains, solid and sure as a well-built bridge, carrying us safely across even when the waters rise and the storms rage. Vernon built Catherine a bridge. Catherine gave Vernon a reason to cross it. And together, they built something that would last forever. A love story for the ages, a testament to the power of kindness and courage and the enduring strength of two hearts that found each other across an impossible distance and chose, against all odds, to build a bridge and walk across it together, safely and surely, into a future neither could have imagined but both had always, deep down, been seeking. Their story ended not with death but with legacy, not with separation but with eternal connection, not with an ending at all but with a beginning that continues to this day in the hearts and lives of everyone who hears it and understands its simple, powerful truth. Love builds bridges. Always has. Always will.